I guess I'll do my own introduction because I maliciously didn't give them a lead or bio for me or whatever, and that's fine. I hate it when people do intros for me. So if you hadn't guessed, my name is Alan Skorkins. Evan Light's in the other room, so if you meant to see Alan, you want to be in here. Evan's over there. No, okay, fine. I'm really Evan Light. And I don't have any titles or anything because technically I'm unemployed for 2 more days. Yay! But I'm starting working for Basho on Monday, and I'll talk about that later. These are all the ways you can reach me. Don't worry about, if you're curious, writing any of this stuff down because, well, other than maybe the Twitter, because I'll have a link to the slides on GitHub. These are all HTML and JavaScript and CSS, which is why there are no frills, because I suck at CSS. Ruby DeCamp is an unconference that I run. Ooh, I should probably take this so I can pace and then make the whole stage collapse. Ruby DeCamp is a conference that I run in the Northern Virginia area. Excuse me while I tie my shoes while I'm talking. It's an unconventional event, particularly because for experts, for intermediate people, and for new folks. Partly because I want to knock my microphone off. Partly because I feel like events like this aren't necessarily the best environment for learning. Conferences I feel are good to get an introduction, a very brief survey. I like depth of conversation. I like to learn a lot. And DeCamp focuses on conversation and drilling down on the topics, not so much one-to-many dialogues as many-to-many dialogues. But it's a small event. So we're full this year. So I'm taunting you by telling you about DeCamp, and you can't attend anyway, sorry. If you have any questions about it, you can Google it and see more. So this talk, well, this isn't exactly where it started, but before I really begin, if you get anything from this talk, it's read that damn book, okay? Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. You have my permission to write that down now, by Martin Fowler. Read the damn book. Now I'll tell you why. First, I'll tell you where this talk came from. This is where that talk came from. There's this little guy, long hair, studded belt, named Avdi, who keeps running around here. He likes to talk about how we should be doing a lot more OO in Rails. And especially he's been touting how, well, he's one of the people who touts how we should be using plain old Ruby objects for our model, and we shouldn't be using ActiveRecord. And this drove me crazy, and that's where most of my talk topics come from, or things that piss me off that I want to talk about. So that's how we got to this one. There'll be a lot more on this. So that slide said, loosely couple all the things. How many of you were in here for Scott Bellware's pretty awesome talk? What, like a third? Shoot, I wish there was more carryover. So for those of you who aren't familiar, we'll talk very briefly about coupling. So this is a very simple example of tight coupling. And I'm doing it by example, and we can talk about definitions if we're really concerned later. But in this case, we have this user controller. I even have the nifty laser pointer. The user controller refers to the user model directly. It is tightly coupled to it. The user controller depends on the user model. In this example, as I mentioned, hyperbolized, we inject, dependency inject, or inversion of control, depending on how you want to call it, more buzzwords for you. We inject a finder into the user controller, we inject the user in, and we just are dependent on this interface. So we have a weaker dependency. I'd say it's a looser form of coupling. And this is the sort of technique that's being advocated, well, across the board for Rails. And generally, I think loose coupling is a good idea, but not necessarily with Rails. Again, more on that as we progress. First, a history lesson. Because I've been programming for, well, you can look at the beard. I got a lot of gray hairs. I've been programming for I guess, 17, 18 years now. And I did about 9 of those in this language. I'm sorry, forgive me. Java, and in 1995 it was great, and then Enterprise Java Beans came along in 1999. At the time, hey, we all thought it was great, because there was so much manual labor on anything server side before EJB. EJB gave you this framework where if you just write lots and lots of XML, you don't have to write very much code. So it's a managed server-side component architecture, which basically means lots of XML. In 2002, this crazy thing called the Spring Framework, ooh, I better not move my left hand there, came along, and that is an inversion of control-based framework. So we talked about loose coupling a little earlier, where you inject things into other things. You don't have hardwired dependencies, and everything is connected together via more XML. But this was actually an improvement over EJB, but still XML. So it was shortly after that that I guess Java development or server-side Java development became more commoditized. More people got into it, perhaps as it got a little more sane. Although people were really jumping on board with the J2EE EJB bandwagon. The one thing that Java had going for it, still does, is the massive marketing machine of then Sun, now Oracle, and all of the money it had behind it. So in 2000, oh sorry, I neglected, in 2003, so we saw a lot more developers. We saw a lot of people overseas doing Java development. There was a lot of demand, but I guess rates started to go down, and developers weren't as appreciated as much. There was more standardization, though. Standardization is generally a good thing if you want reliable, predictable code. But what I started to see was you had a lot of really smart people. Like, if any of you have heard of Relevance Inc. in North Carolina, almost that entire company now is doing, well, wow. Yeah, right, they started doing Rails back then, ironically. And then this guy named Dave Thomas, the Prague book, the Pickaxe got popular, and then the Rails book came out, and then everyone started doing Rails. Well, ironically, we're starting to follow that trend, I think, with Ruby, with Rails especially. And I noticed some things that I considered to be predictors for that switch, that in the Java ecology, there were, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 different jars, libraries, to do the same thing. And a lot of them would be good, some of them would be terrible. But how would you know which ones were which? And then they developed the loose coupling fixation. And remember, I said loose coupling is a good thing, but the Java community became very obsessed with it, and it made some of us, at least me, and I know other people, when they saw Spring, they thought, oh, that's horrible. But there's some virtues to it. And yet it chased a lot of us away. So I'm going to ask you to consider, where's Rails now? Because Rails is about 10 years old. I'm getting a little ahead there. Rails is about 10 years old, which is about where Java was when I jumped ship, and I saw a lot of other people jumping ship. So Rails is good for making developing small apps go really, really fast. Note, small, not large apps, not enterprise apps. And it makes development fast, as I'm sure a lot of you know. I want to ask, before I go much further, how many of you do Rails for a living? Gee, funny, that's almost every hand in the room. Sorry, keep your hands up for a second. I said, how many of you do just plain Ruby? Okay, and that's very, very, very few. Right, a minority. And by the way, that's soon going to be me. So Rails goes a lot faster, as I'm sure a lot of you already know then, via selective tight coupling. And then constraining around the first 80% of what's common in web development and the problems that we usually solve. So some examples of that would be how we get mappings for free from the model to the controller, from the controller to the template, and how we get the metadata mapping from ActiveRecord to the database. And these things make our development go a lot faster. But what about the remaining 20%? What about some of the harder problems we have to deal with, like we want to split our apps into two, or just simply our models get too big, too complex? How about some kind of guide for how to help our design of our domain? So this is where we get into a heuristic problem. This is not something that can be solved by automation. Now that Scott's here. That it's a problem that is very driven, the solution is very driven by expertise, trial and error. And now anecdotes suck as evidence, so I did a lot of research. These slides might not look like much to you, but I spent, 60 or 80 hours in this presentation. It's almost all about the content. As again, I suck at CSS. But the way I see it in the Rails community, now we are living in a time a lot like Java, say in 2005, that we now have an overabundance of options. Take, for example, if you want to add authentication to your app. If you're an experienced Rails developer, you can probably easily think of 7 or 10 different solutions, and there are probably even more popular ones than that. So how do you choose? So that quickly brought me that got me to think about this book that I'd heard of. Turns out it was actually written in the mid-90s called The Paradox of Choice. So I actually read a fair amount of that in researching this. And I found a few pithy anecdotes in there. So this one, choosing well is especially difficult when we're trying to make the best choices. Schwartz also talks about a term called satisficing. That is that we have different criterias. We operate from different criterias of what satisfies our need. There are some people who are more perfection-driven, who want to explore all the options, and then there are some people who are willing to compromise and just look at a very small subset and very quickly pick. That's dangerous when you have an awful lot of choices, the latter. But it's very easy to fall into that, because if you go for perfection, you're probably going to end up very frustrated and spend a lot of time and money. And the next, we'd be better off if we embraced certain voluntary constraints on our freedom of choice instead of rebelling against them. This isn't a reference to the NSA. I'm actually here talking a little bit more about what Rails introduced us to, a convention-based approach to development. Granted, some of you might have already seen something like that with Objective-C protocols before, but Rails really made this a lot more popular. So in terms of choosing, Schwartz also noted, citing studies, I'm sorry, I'm not going to cite them in the slides, but you can go read the book, that we're prone, well, to choosing badly. That is, that probably due to evolution, that we use available information over reliable information. For example, you might trust Steve Klabnik, Avdi, Katrina Owen, for example. You might trust them an awful lot, but maybe they haven't blogged about some particular topic or another. Over reliable information. Considering them reliable, they're experts. And that we tend to trust near sources over trusted sources. So say you have a coworker sitting at the desk next to you, and Avdi's written a blog post about something. There's still a very strong likelihood, despite being rational beings, that you're probably going to go with your less expert coworker sitting next to you than the blog post. That might sound crazy, but just something to think about next time you're trying to make a choice and you're going to ask a colleague, and there's available information that says to the contrary. We're also surprisingly vulnerable to effective advertising. This is probably something of a no-brainer, but you probably also have that naive belief, like I do, that you're not affected by advertisements that much. And then think about some of the more clever advertisements you see on TV and how much more often you at least notice and are aware of a product, possibly as a result. I mention this because I think that's us. That we're obsessed with new things. People in this community, maybe less so than we used to be, because this community's more mature, dare I say now, that we've been around almost 10 years, that we're obsessed with new. And Alan Kay has this wonderful quote that anything that grows faster in education becomes a pop culture. So what's our pop culture? I contend that it's things like this. These are patterns. And every one of them, each one of these is a link. That's why it's red. So you can click on these later if you want when I put them online. And then there's a gem that goes with each one of them. There didn't used to be one for DCI. That now has a gem. Yay, more automation. Scott's got his head in his hands. Or another example. I'll let this one speak for itself. Which leads me to the title of this talk. So we're going to talk about patterns, if you hadn't guessed, because I told you to read that damn book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. Read it. Thank you. So patterns are exemplars. And in reaching for how we come to patterns, granted, there are books on this, and I didn't have time to read those, but I saw a few different steps involved. One, we identify some practice that we perform routinely. Two, we decide that we're going to give it some kind of nomenclature. But then we get to Scott's favorite. If it can be imitated, it can be automated. For those of you who weren't here, automation can be a bad thing. So we create the tool, a tool from the pattern. Then we use a tool and we figure out how best to use the tool. And this is maybe where we fall down, that we become limited by the tools. Then once we find what we don't like about the tool, because the tool's limited us, then we go back to step one. So Rails is made of patterns, as it turns out. And perhaps not so ironically, every single one of these is in Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. By the way, that book came out 1 year before Rails. I've never heard DHH say that POEA informed Rails, but I'll be damned if it didn't. So where did all of these patterns that I cited earlier come from? Must have been, step 5. What's wrong with Rails? So let's talk about more Martin Fowler, because we can't get enough Martin Fowler. Refactoring tends to break small objects, or big objects, into smaller objects, big methods into smaller ones. And indirection is a two-edged sword. But it can also make your programs harder to read as you end up delegating to objects, delegate to objects, delegate to objects. Or, as a friend of mine, Brian Hogan, said, refactoring the patterns can be better than just starting with them over designing. To borrow a little bit from Leonard Bones McCoy, for those of you who are old enough to remember the original Star Trek movie, thank you, Corey, for smiling. I know engineers, they love to change things. Now let's get specific. Let's talk about ActiveRecord. Note that's ActiveRecord with a space, not ActiveRecord without the space. With the space, we're talking about a pattern that's described in Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. And without the space, we're talking about the library, that thing that you guys probably use all the time in your day-to-day job. So this is what Avdi and a lot of other people are saying we should be doing now. This thing on the left is a person model. We'll say it's a domain model object. This thing on the right, well, that would be ActiveRecord. But that's not ActiveRecord. There's a pattern for that. It's called TableDataGateway, and it's in Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. You seeing a trend here yet? So don't bother reading this whole paragraph. Let's just focus on a couple of sentences here. These couple sentences, if the mapping is simple, ActiveRecord is adequate. If the mapping is complex, DataMapper, another pattern, we'll talk about it, works better. Simple, complex, gee, I guess that's probably heuristic. How do you choose? So DataMapper, this is the DataMapper pattern I just mentioned. We have a domain model object on the right. It has behavior, it has properties, and we have a mapper in the middle. We'll talk about what a mapper is, and a database on the right side. What the mapper's purpose is to provide a separation between the database and your domain model. That is, it's responsible for all the persistence and all the data lookup, and it creates your domain model objects when you're fetching data from the database, and it persists them to the database when you need to store them. That way, your domain model object can be entirely ignorant of how it's being stored. Sounds great, right? That sounds like exactly what Avdi was talking about before. Turns out you can use a TableDataGateway to help implement a DataMapper. Hey, we're mixing and matching patterns now. So there's this thing called DataMapper. Note there's no space. That is not the same thing as DataMapper with the space. DataMapper with no space is a gem. DataMapper with the space is a pattern. Let's make it more confusing. DataMapper without a space is a gem that's actually an ActiveRecord with a space. But so I'll ask you, can we use an ActiveRecord to make an ActiveRecord library to use a DataMapper with a space? Well, I'll let you read that. There we go. So let me introduce you to this thing called the repository pattern, also in Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. This is another one I've heard people float around a lot lately. And a repository pattern is can use a data mapper, and here it would use an ActiveRecord like a really weak data mapper. So you have this repository facade here, which accepts queries. You can expose all kinds of different queries on it. It's a little bit like the TableDataGateway, but it uses something else behind it, an in-memory strategy. That could be your data mapper, your ActiveRecord. From that, it generates your domain model object. So I guess you could say it's just yet another layer of abstraction, which you may or may not need. But there's a gem for this also, really a very simple one, not hard to read. There's a link for it. Code's pretty clean. I thought it was sort of a step in the right direction. I played with it a little bit. So what you do if you wanted to use the EDR gem, which stands for Entity Data Relationship, incidentally, it's kind of irrelevant. Your ActiveRecord, it works based on naming convention, bears mentioning, that you have an order data ActiveRecord class, then you have an order domain model object. So that's the naming convention. If you have a foo domain model object, you have to have a foo data ActiveRecord object. Now, the one thing that makes me really uncomfortable about this is lines 2 through 4. That EDR has this problem where if you want to have an association, that you have to have your model be aware that it interacts with the repository. And at that point, I feel like the framework has failed because now your domain model is dependent on something outside of the domain model. And that's kind of a bummer. And then you have a repository, which is really mostly declarative. And then, as I was mentioning here on like lines 5 through 7, you're just arbitrarily exposing another query, which is then going to go to ActiveRecord, go to the ordered data class. So, sorry, that's the domain model object. That's just a PORO, plain old Ruby object. And I'll actually mention that more often, so thanks for asking. It's a plain old Ruby object, but it has this extra method to be repository aware. So, sorry, so line 6 is the placeholder for it. That's where the rest of your code would go.
So why do you think there's an add item on that order?
Because this is representative of an order has many items. So let me go back. We've got this association here in the ordered data. So all the active record's aware of the relationships, but the domain model, well, doesn't have to be aware that it has other objects, but if there's an association, you probably want to have some kind of method for interacting with that associated thing. So now, but I wouldn't want that method to have to be aware that it's talking to a repository. I would personally prefer that that was just an array of stuff and not a call to a repository or a wrapper around an array. So, as I was saying, you probably don't want to use this gem. You probably don't want to use my little hack on the gem that I wrote either. That's why I took it out of these slides. But imagine your domain model could look something like this. Now, Vertis, that's included here in these classes, these two classes, is a small gem that fell out of another project that I'm going to get to in a minute. But it's a lot like Active Model, just I find it a bit simpler and more declarative. That code should be pretty easy to read. But you can declare your associations, you declare what the types are of the associations. You can have validations like you would on Active Model. This doesn't tie you to a database at all. This is just saying this is what this domain model object will look like. These are the properties it has. And then you just put your behavior in there. And you can actually make something like that work right now if you really want to using, say, ActiveRecord, but then you have to write your own DataMapper. And, well, this is just the DataMapper. There's a lot more to using a DataMapper when you have a complex domain model than just having a mapper. And that's where ROM comes in. And by the way, thank God someone's old enough here to recognize that character. And also nerdy enough to have read that comic book, perhaps, which stands for Ruby Object Mapper. And Ruby Object Mapper is actually DataMapper 2, DataMapper no space. It was a renaming of DataMapper 2, which is a project that's been in the works for over a year. It's being maintained or run by, I should say, Dan Kubb and Peter Solnicka, both really nice guys. It's not all there, but there is an awful lot of code. You can just Google ROM RB, and you should be able to find it pretty quickly. It's beautiful, beautiful code, but it's a bit difficult to get into because it's designed so well that there's a lot of indirection, which makes it a little hard to follow, just kind of like Fowler was talking about. But your choice is either you have God classes or you have lots of small classes, so they went for smaller classes and lots of gems that interact with one another. In any event, they are wonderful, wonderful guys. They would love to have more participation in the project. There is a kind of steep learning curve, though, but if you're willing to do it, they're willing to work with you on it. I would be, but I'm one of those people who is leaving the Rails community and going to what I perceive to be greener fields and not working in Rails anymore at all and just working in Ruby and Erlang now. So remember what I said about, that there being an exodus in Java land. It's already begun in Ruby land. That is, but I'll step back. Maybe Java developers weren't crazy when they came up with Spring. That they felt a problem. They had a lot of tight coupling in their enterprise apps. They tried to solve that problem using a lot of XML. But the nice thing is that they have, or had at the time, I think they still use Spring by degrees, that they had plain old Java objects. Very easy to test, very easy to design by comparison. To me, one of the biggest problems that we face I say we, inclusively, that you guys face now, sorry, in the Rails community is that perhaps you've become somewhat inured to what is difficult to do in Rails because you perceive it to be easier than what you did before, and so you don't think about it being hard. Having come from Java, doing testing in Rails seemed brilliantly easy. But if you think about it, you have model tests, whether you're using RSpec or test unit or whatever. You have a different API for testing models than you do for testing controllers than you do for integration tests. It gets even worse if you add routing specs or if you add Cucumber, acceptance tests, if you will. If you add all the additional tooling to it, it gets even harder. But there's essential tooling that you have no choice but to use if you just want to test models, controllers, and do integration tests. They all have slightly different APIs. You're tied to the framework. And that's where this all began. That's where I got really annoyed and said, hey, this sucks. Maybe we shouldn't be, or I already talked about that. Maybe we're due for our spring, your spring, not mine anymore. Maybe we're due for the Ruby equivalent of spring. Maybe we're due to have a different framework. Maybe that's really what we're looking for here. We keep trying to make Rails into something that it's not. Rails is designed to make the first 80% of small app development fast. Whoever said it was designed to make really big apps? 37 Signals might tell you that, but they have an agenda behind telling you that by degrees. I mean, that's what all of their apps are written in. They make their money off of it. Granted, you guys are all invested in it, but we've got this nice framework called Rack underneath. We could be easily trying to build other frameworks that are based on plain old Ruby objects that might not depend on XML because we have this great Turing-complete language called Ruby that we could use to wire our Ruby together with. And then the wiring would be easily testable. So maybe we need to be building, need to be thinking about building, well, don't think about it, do it, building a framework of plain old Ruby objects. So Rails is almost 10 years old, as I was saying. And Rails apps are growing more complex. And Rails isn't meeting the need. We have too many choices already because it's too old by way of entropy. There are too many choices. We need more curation, but we're not seeing developers merge their gems. We're seeing people tout their pet projects. And we need a framework designed for implicitly from the ground up for large apps. We don't have it. POEAA predates Rails. It provides alternatives for every single pattern in Rails. It gives you another way of doing it, tells you about the trade-offs in choosing each one of these patterns. So look there for answers. That's all I've got.